Do you need to train to complete and utter muscular failure to make substantial gains in muscular hypertrophy and strength? Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's controversial. High-intensity training, such as that practiced by Mike Mentzer, Ray Mentzer, Dorian Yates, all these people did practice a very low volume of training, meaning they didn't do a lot of sets and reps, but they usually trained to complete and utter failure. And they attributed a lot of their progress to that. However, they were basically acolytes of another guy named Arthur Jones. Arthur Jones showed up around 1970 or so. He introduced a new type of exercise training machine called it was a whole set of machines called the Nautilus exercise machines. And they were designed, they had a special cam that allowed you supposedly to work a muscle through a full range of motion. He noted that when you did, for example, exercise like barbell curls, there were points in the exercise or repetition where there was almost no resistance whatsoever on the bicep muscle. And the Nautilus cams were designed to put resistance from the start to the finish throughout the whole repetition range. And as a result, you worked more muscle fibers. But to maximize that effect, Jones advocated training to complete failure. Now, complete failure means complete failure. It's easier said than done. A lot of people who I've observed over the years who claim to be training to total muscular failure, it was very clear to me that they weren't training to failure. Before I discuss the science studies that have looked at whether training to failure is necessary, let me allow me to relate my own experiences. When Jones showed up in 1970, I was intrigued by his system of training, high intensity and the Nautilus machines. At the time, I was using extremely high volume of training. My total number of sets per muscle group average anywhere from 30, you won't believe this, to 70. That's right, some muscles, like back, I did 70 sets. And looking back in retrospect, I admit I was spinning my wheels. I was very young at the time. I got away with it, but I was actually wasting a lot of time in the gym that wasn't necessary. And a friend talked me into trying this high-intensity system, or advocated by Arthur Jones. I did it. At first, I did it with only free weights. He kind of he offered a couple of routines where you could use free weights rather than machines. The machines weren't immediately available. And then I went to, eventually the machines were introduced to the gym, the Nautilus machines, and I did the Nautilus machines. Again, going to complete failure. Basically, what I did is 1 to 2 sets per exercise. I trained the whole body 3 times a week. Each workout took me at the maximum 30 minutes, usually between 20 and 25 minutes, believe it or not, 3 times a week. And again, I went from doing 50 to 70 sets down to doing something like 3 or 4 sets per muscle group. I went in very skeptical, thinking that this isn't going to work. How could I gain with so little volume? Well, to make a long story short, I wound up making the best gains I ever made in my entire bodybuilding career. In the months that I used the high intensity training system, I went to failure. I was very, very big on progressive resistance, which is the underlying basis of weight training. What that means is you should always try and progress, add add a little more reps, add a little more weight. You always have to increase the resistance somehow to make continued gains. That's called progressive resistance. And using this system, it was very important to do that. So I would add as little as 2 pounds to an exercise bar or something like that. But I was always progressive. Every workout, I had to do either more reps or a little bit added weight. And this went on for months. And, I had never trained that progressively, meaning like most bodybuilders in the gym, I went in, I did, the exercises. I didn't really increase the weight that often. I did occasionally because I was able to get much stronger, much faster back then. So I did, but it wasn't necessarily every workout where I would increase weight or reps. I didn't pay much attention to that, but I did when I used the high-intensity training system. And training to failure was a large part of it. I could still recall doing heavy barbell curls using the high-intensity system. And I remember doing it. I curled until the weight, literally, I couldn't even grip it. It actually, the bar fell out of my hands. I couldn't move that bar even a millimeter. That was true training to failure. And if you really train like that, a high volume becomes impossible because the muscle gets so fatigued. You cannot do 20 sets to failure. It's virtually impossible. I don't care what your level of genetics. I don't care how great you are or how strong you are. The muscle dies if you really go to failure. You're limited. The number of sets you can do with the volume of training is limited. But the whole point of training is to activate. If you're looking for muscle size or muscle hypertrophy, your goal should be to activate as many muscle fibers as possible. Now here we have to look at a scientific principle designed by a scientist named Henneman back in 1957. It's called Henneman's Principle of Muscle Contraction. What it says, you have different types of muscle fibers, basically two main types. Type 1 or slow twitch, they're also called endurance muscle fibers. And then you have the type 2 fast twitch, which have less endurance but greater strength and muscle size capacity. Again, obviously, if you want to have bigger muscles, you want to activate the type 2 muscle fibers. And the type 2 muscle fibers come in 2 or 3 varieties, but the type most associated with increased muscle hypertrophy is called the type 2X. There's one called type 2A, which is what most bodybuilders work in traditional workout routines. In other words, when you do like 4 sets of 8 or something like that, not necessarily failure, you're working the type 2A, which is capable of hypertrophy, but it's kind of an intermediate fiber. It has endurance characteristics and size characteristics. But in other words, it has a little bit more endurance than the type 2X, but not as much as type 1. Now, what's the point? The point is that Henneman's size principle stated that the way a muscle works, when you first start to do an exercise, the initial muscle fibers that are recruited during the exercise are the type 1 endurance fibers. As they fatigue, the other fibers take over. It goes from type 1 then to type 2A or something like that. You're starting to get into type 2 as the muscles get fatigued. Most bodybuilders, the way they train, never get past the type 2A fibers, which again are capable of growth, obviously, but they're not the real maximum strength and size fibers. Those are the type 2B. Now, to get to that, how do you get to type 2B? Well, you got to continue the set past type 2A, which would be, there's 2 ways to do that. One way is to train to failure. If you train to failure, the type 2A fibers will kind of check out, and the exercise is passed on to the type 2X fibers. Those are the strength and muscle size fibers. If you go to failure, you get those fibers. There is another way, however, lifting heavy weights. Just lifting heavy weights, and when I'm talking about heavy weights, I'm talking about 80% of 1 rep maximum and up. You don't have to go to failure. When you lift heavy weights, the muscles can kind of detect the amount of stress on them, to move the weight, and the type 2B fibers are activated. So an essential point here is that the type 2X fibers, you don't need to train to failure to activate them if you lift heavy weights, right? Now, if you lift light weights, and a couple of years ago, they came out with studies. They were looking at older people who were frail. They hadn't exercised in maybe their lives. They were trying to, there's a condition called sarcopenia, which involves a loss of muscle mass with age, and it has a high relationship to increased mortality. Most people are in nursing homes not because of mental reasons, but because of extreme frailty. They're so weak they can't even stand up, they can't feed themselves, they can't dress themselves. This is what happens when you get sarcopenia, and eventually your heart gives out, you die. That's basically what happens. So these scientists are trying to figure out, wait, how can we get these people to gain a little strength, maybe gain a little bit of muscle so that they don't fall into that sarcopenic stage. So the researchers at Tufts University in Massachusetts, they started experimenting, and they developed a program that involved training with extreme light weights. I'm talking like 20% of 1 rep maximum. That would be like a warm-up weight. But to the older people, it was considerable amount of weight, because remember, these people were very weak. But what they had them do is they had them do I believe the first exercise they used was leg extensions rather than upper body work. They had these older people do leg extensions, higher reps, maybe 25 to 30 reps per set. They only did like 1 or 2 sets, but they did it to failure. They were monitored and they were told to go to failure. What happened was amazing changes occurred in the older people. Old men who had to use walkers to move around, they were able to throw away the walkers. They got their mobility back. Some of the older people as old as 90 years old, actually started to gain a little bit of muscle. Now, these people could never, get enough muscle to challenge Mr. Olympia, but to put muscle on at 90 years old is quite an accomplishment. And more so to gain the mobility back where you can move and you can feed yourself, where you don't have to be in a nursing home. That was a tremendous accomplishment. So later on, about a year later, they decided to test the system on younger people people in their 20s and 30s that were mobile and didn't have sarcopenia. They had them. They designed a study where they broke these. They divided these younger, let's call them younger bodybuilders, into 2 groups. One group used very light weights, about 30 to 40% of 1 rep max, but they also did 20 to 30 reps to complete failure. Very important to go to complete failure, because you have to. The only way you can get those deep muscle fibers, the type 2 muscle fibers, if you're lifting light weights, the only way to get them is to go to failure. If you just lift light weights and do 20 reps, you're going to be only working the type 1 fibers. You're not going to get much muscle growth, because the type 1 fibers, they do grow, they do hypertrophy, but nothing in comparison to the type 2. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which I'm not going to get into here. But all you have to know is the type 2 fibers and the muscle fibers that grow. And what they found in this younger group, they had, again, one group did the light weights, let's say 30% of 1 rep max, 20 to 30 reps to complete failure. The other group did the standard heavy weight using 90% of 1 rep. Now that's heavy weight. That's heavy. That's like a weight you can only get like maybe 4 or 5, at the most 6 reps, right? At the end of the study, when they compared muscle hypertrophy, and by the way, the guys that did the 90% weight did not go to failure. All they did is lift the heavy weight. At the end of the study, when they measured the amount of muscle hypertrophy in both groups, the amount of muscle hypertrophy was the same, meaning the guys that lifted the light weights, 20 to 30 reps, and went to failure, gained as much muscle size as the guys that used 90% of 1 rep max. So what could we deduce from all that? We could deduce that if you're going to if you prefer to lift light weights, again, maybe 30 to 40% of 1 rep max. If you're going to do that, you got to do higher reps, 20 to 30 reps, because you got to stimulate something called metabolic stress. Again, I'm not going to get into what it is. I write about it in my Applied Metabolic newsletter, but let's put it this way: metabolic stress is one of the 3 factors that are considered important for muscle hypertrophy, and it takes a little bit more reps to get into to get enough metabolic stress going. That's why you have to do 20, 30 reps, and to get those type 2B muscle fibers, you have to, or the type 2 fibers, you have to go to failure. Now, I should also point out that a later study took a closer look at the muscle growth that was induced by doing light weight to failure, and what they found was that the muscle fiber, they did get muscle growth or muscle hypertrophy, but the growth was actually mostly in the type 1 fibers, which was surprising, because type 1 fibers, as I said, are usually considered muscle endurance fibers. They don't grow that much, but under certain circumstances, apparently they do grow. So the majority of muscle gains made by doing high reps to failure were type 1. So what can we do? What we can draw a line under that. It says that if you want to get the type 2B fiber, there's no escaping heavy weight. You got to go to heavy weight. But getting back to my story, when I did the high intensity training, as I said, I trained 3 times a week, whole body workouts, 1 to 2 sets per exercise. I gained tremendous amounts of strength. I gained tremendous amounts of muscle size. The gym where I was training at, everyone was accusing me of using steroids. I wasn't. I was just eating normal food, taking like liver tablets. I wasn't even taking a lot of supplements. I think I might have been taking a milk and egg protein. That was it. And I gained like crazy because my training was very progressive. I was constantly adding weight or reps. No 2 workouts were the same. When you train like that, you literally force your muscles to grow. So I was gaining like crazy. But the thing is, I didn't use the lightweight method. We didn't know that back then. All I knew was to try and I was told to try and lift as heavy as possible, whatever I can handle in good form. So I trained heavy all the time. That's the way Mike Mentzer and Dorian Yates trained. And what happened with Dorian Yates and Mike Mentzer is eventually, this is a drawback of training heavy to failure all the time. If you go to muscular failure in every set with heavy weight, it takes a toll on the joints, where eventually you're going to have a lot of joint problems. Mike Mentzer had joint pain all over his body. He told me this himself. Dorian Yates told me off the record that the reason he retired from bodybuilding was not because he was afraid of Ronnie Coleman or anyone else. He retired because he had so many injuries. He didn't say it was from training to failure, but or lifting heavy weights, but he retired because he had a number of injuries. You could see it in the photos. The last couple of years he trained. I mean, he had bicep injury, he had a lat injury, he had a hamstring injury. I mean, this is what happens when you train with heavy weights to failure all year round. So, but my problem was different. I didn't get injured. After about 3 months, I remember I was using the high intensity routine. I was on about the 3rd month, and I was gaining like crazy. And who comes up to me in the gym? This is the original Gold's Gym in Venice. But my old friend Arnold Schwarzenegger, some of you guys might have heard of him. He comes up to me and he's watching me do these. I was training legs. I was doing leg press, extension, and squats, one after another, all to muscle failure, except for the squats. That's too dangerous to go to failure on them. But anyway, he was watching me do this, and he says, Jerry, he says, you can't keep that up forever. I said, what do you mean, Arnold? He says, you can't train with that level of intensity. He says, sooner or later, your mind will give up. It's too hard on you psychologically to have to come into the gym and push that hard all the time and lift heavy weights like that. And I said, Arnold, I'm only training 3 times a week, 20 minutes. I mean, come on. He says, watch and see. And I kind of poo-pooed him. I said, at the time I was making such great gains. I figured Arnold's just too lazy to try it, so he's trying to talk me out of it. It turns out that Arnold was right. After about 6 months, I never got any injuries, but I just burned out mentally. I got to the point where I just couldn't stand the thought of having to go to the gym and push weight to failure every time and add. It was just too hard on the mind. And that's when I realized, I kind of thought about it, and I said, training to failure is great for a number of reasons. In other words, if you've been overtraining, for example, if you've done like 20, 30 sets or more, something like that, and you've reached a plateau, you're not making any gains in muscle size or strength. If you suddenly switch to a high intensity program where you do much less exercise volume, meaning not as many sets per, maybe 3 to 6 sets per muscle group, but you go to failure. Now you could use either the light system I described earlier, or if you don't want to go to failure, you could use heavy weight. But here's the key. You limit it to a certain amount of time, maybe 3 months. They call that periodization, where let's say for a couple of months you train heavy, then a couple of months you train moderate weight, then you train lightweight. You switch it off. If you do it that way, for maybe 3 months or so, you'll get all the benefit of training to failure with heavy weights. By the way, if you lift heavy weights, again, you don't have to go to failure. But let's say you do the light high rep system, then you have to go to failure. But if you do it for 3 months, you get all the benefits, but you don't get the mental burnout because you're only doing it for 3 months. Now, there's another thing, other things you should know. In case you're wondering, I went back to conventional training after that. But to this day, I do something that some sports scientists recommend. I don't train every exercise to failure, but I still keep my volume low. I have to. At my age, quite honestly, I can't use a lot of volume. I get injured, and it just doesn't do anything for me. I don't make any gains. So I only do maybe 9, at the most 15 sets for larger muscles like thighs and back. Most of my smaller body parts I do about 6 to 9 sets. But the way I do it, every set I do it to what they call near failure, meaning let's say I do 12 reps, right? By the 8th rep, I'm ready to put the weight down. I know this is where most people would just put the weight down because it's very painful. You can hardly, the velocity of the exercise goes down. You can hardly move the weight. I continue for another, let's say 2 reps, make it to 10 reps. If I went to 11 or 12, that would be failure where I couldn't lift it at all. I stop at 10 reps, meaning I stop just short of failure. What they found in recent studies is if you train in that manner, meaning if you train close to failure, not necessarily all the way, in other words, leave a little bit in the bank, as they say, you get all the benefits, according to these studies, of training to muscular failure without having to train to fail. I still do that to this day. Another way to train to failure, for extended time, I should say, is save the failure set. In other words, let's say you're doing 4 sets of an exercise. What you do is on the let's say 4 sets. The first 3 sets you do in a conventional manner. You can go near failure, like I train, right? On the 4th set, if you want, the 4th set you go to complete failure. You don't want to go to complete failure on the 1st set because that'll destroy the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th set because the muscle fatigue will be so much you won't be able to get much out of it. But in other words, if you save going to failure on the last set, you probably get almost all the benefits of training to failure without any of the drawbacks. So, what else can I tell you? Also, the recent studies show they've looked at training to failure in older men over 40, and what they found is, again, as I experienced, there's actually no advantage to training to failure when you're over 40. You don't get any more progress. It does increase the risk of injury. So they advise older men over 40, if you want to train intensely, train to near failure, like I do. In other words, stop maybe 2 or 3 reps short of failure. Don't try going to complete failure if you're over 40, because there's one thing you should know about training to failure. It causes a great amount of muscle damage. Now, muscle damage, besides metabolic stress, muscle damage is one of the 3 cornerstones of muscle hypertrophy. The other one is mechanical tension. You get that from lifting heavy. But in other words, the muscle damage incurred by training to failure is extensive. It causes a lot of muscle damage. It requires more recovery. So that's another thing. The frequency has to be down. Any muscle that's trained to failure, you need at least 48 hours rest between workouts. Otherwise, you're not going to make any gains because you'll be overtraining the muscle. What else can I tell you? Let me see here. Also, don't fool yourself. This is another thing I was going to tell you. As I said earlier, a lot of people think they're training to failure, and they don't. I've watched them. Actually, I've watched Mike Mensa when he was a personal trainer. He used to train his clients to allegedly failure. And I watched him train a couple of clients, and I could see these guys were not going to failure. They had a lot more. Most of them never went to failure. And I got to tell you, training to failure is not as easy as it sounds. You have to have a very, very high tolerance for pain. It's very painful. Most people can't tolerate that level of pain, and they stop short of training to failure anyway. But here's the deal: unless you train, even if you don't want to train to complete muscle failure, unless you train close to failure, like I said, maybe 2-3 reps short of failure, you're not going to get the maximum number of muscle fibers, and as a consequence, your gains will be much slower. If you just train like most guys do this stuff, they don't do nothing. They do the same thing. There's no intensity. Watch those guys. Don't take my word for it. Watch those guys in the gym. You'll see they never make 1 iota of gains. They never change because they're not stressing their muscles enough. Your muscles have to have overload. That's one of the principles of resistance training. Besides progressive resistance, you have to have an overload of some kind. That could be increased reps. It could be training to failure, increase weight. Unless you prod your muscles, the body tries to maintain what is called homeostasis. It wants to stay the way it is. You have to push it a little bit. You don't want to push it too much because then it works in reverse. That's called hormesis, where something that's beneficial in a certain amount starts to goes negative past a certain point. So you want to be careful not to push it too far, but you have to apply some sort of overload in order to make gains. So also there's some suggestions I've made in science studies that the training to failure might be more useful or better if it's limited to single joint movements. In other words, like bicep curls, triceps, that type of thing. Going to failure on heavier exercises like squats, bent over rows, that could be a little problematic because there's a greater chance of injury. So training to failure is probably a little bit safer when you're doing what they call single joint exercises. So that's about it. As I said, just to sum up, I think training to failure is a very useful resource. It can get you out of a training plateau where you start growing again, getting stronger. But I think the time you use it should be limited to maybe 3 months or more if you want to do it consistently. You have your choice to either go lightweight to failure, using 20 to 30 reps, lightweight but it has to be done to failure. If you go the route of lightweight, meaning 30 to 40% of 1 rep max, 20 to 30 reps, it has to be done. Really, that one has to be done to failure, not near failure. Failure. However, if you go the heavyweight route to failure, you don't have to go to failure at all. Just lifting heavy weights will recruit the maximum number of muscle fibers. So that's about it. If you want further information about training, exercise science, supplement science, which supplements work, which ones don't, the best fat loss techniques, anti-aging research you can use today, ergogenic aids, hormonal therapy like testosterone replacement therapy, women's health and fitness, all of these topics are covered every month in my Applied Metabolics newsletter. It's 30 to up to 50 pages each month. No advertisements, pure information based on evidence-based science, and also includes my nearly 60 years, I think it's about 58 years now, of empirical, meaning in the trenches, in the gym. I've trained, I know what works and what doesn't work, and I incorporate all this in my Applied Metabolics newsletter, www.appliedmetabolics.com. So subscribe today. When you subscribe today, I'll send you an invitation to join my private Applied Metabolics Facebook page, where every day I post new information on medicine, exercise science, and nutrition. I also have an email portal on my Applied Metabolics webpage, where current subscribers only can send me short questions about anything they read in Applied Metabolics or anything else that comes to mind, but they have to be current subscribers. All of you who are watching this video, if you have any suggestions for future videos, send them to Generation Iron, and they will refer them to me, and possibly I can make a video out of it. So thanks for listening. Again, www.appliedmetabolics.com. Go to your local shelter, adopt a dog. They're the best friends you'll ever have. Trust me on that. Trust me on that.